You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast with myself, Anne Walker. In this session, we're going to talk to Natasha Adams around dealing with stress. So what I wanted to do is really examine the challenges of exposure to high stress situations, the principle of psychological stunning, and how to deal with the concepts of amygdala hijack. So we're going to reflect with Tash on a seminal case that she experienced and her reflections on it. We're also going to reflect on how to harness and control these psychological and physiological stressors in practice, and how to get the best out of yourself in a situation such as this. We're also going to look at the adage and concept of cognitive switches that Tash uses to de-escalate from the stress of the shift, and how she approaches self-care within her practice. So Natasha Adams is a Senior Critical Care Paramedic within Queensland Ambulance Service, working on the Woodridge CCP POD with the High Acuity Response Unit, so the HARU unit. Her clinical interests include progressive out-of-hospital care, clinical education, and leadership development. Natasha is currently working on a project with graduate paramedic induction programs, but will soon progress through to a full review of Queensland Ambulance Service clinical education and operational areas. Tash, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tash, I wonder if we could just start by getting you to maybe recount this first visceral experience you had in practice, and maybe just how it occurred, and indeed the sort of the state of startle and what triggered it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we all started working in this field, the very first time that you see a really sick patient, you aren't ready for it and how you're going to react for it. And the very first time that I saw what seemingly was a sick patient to me was when I wasn't actually in the ambulance service and got put on a ride along. And it was an 89-year-old who had APO, and I had no concept of what it even was. And I remember being frozen in the corner, shaking, distressed by the wife being distressed. And when I think back to that now, I think how visceral that reaction was to what was happening in front of me. But if you break it down into its small parts, you can see that the reasons that I had that reaction were a few. I had no awareness of what was happening. I didn't understand the physiology or the physical symptoms that the patient was exhibiting. And I didn't know, and I wasn't equipped with an ability to treat. I was just there simply observing. So that reaction, I'd say, is a normal reaction for anybody who is a bystander to something that is unusual and unknown, and it does elicit that fear response. So moving forward into my career, the case that really stands out for me for where my performance really fell down was when I had first started as a critical care paramedic. So I was probably around 2 years into my role. And even though I'd been to quite a lot of work, you still can't experience everything. And I definitely hadn't experienced what I experienced this day. So I was dispatched to a multi-patient incident, 2 people on a motorbike that had run into each other. And there was very limited information, and it was in an area that we didn't really have any details for. I responded primary to the job in my single response car, and I was being backed up just by a single ACP or advanced care paramedic crew in Queensland. And we were still getting all this differing information on where to find it. So my usual process of thinking through what I might do or thinking through steps of a job was disrupted by constant radio traffic, trying to figure out where the incident was. There was updates that someone was now getting CPR done, and then there was an update that they were children. And so all of this was coming in a scattered way, and I couldn't read any of the massive updates that were coming through on my data terminal either. So I really wasn't set up well. And when we got there, we couldn't get the transportable ambulance through to where they were. And I had to very quickly try and figure out what gear from that ambulance we needed to put into my ambulance, my four-wheel drive, so that we could drive around a bollard. We ended up on a really steep angle. It made me, I'd never done that before. I was really worried for myself and the other people I'd put in my car, and started to think, what if I hurt someone or we don't get there? Quick, we have to get there. And the crew were really overwhelmed as well. They'd never been to anything like this before. And it should have been my role, reflecting back, to bring everything down and calm everything down. But I think that I bolstered it up. So when we arrived on scene, we noticed that there were two patients. One was sitting up and moving, and the other one, about 15 metres from them, had CPR in progress. They were both paediatrics, so young adolescents, and there were some parents on scene. So the crew and I got out. We went over to the patient that had CPR in progress. Another person turned up and went over to the other patient and yelled out to me, "They're okay." Well, that's what I thought that I heard. And we continued to treat the pediatric patient who was in cardiac arrest. The advanced care paramedic crew were unable to open the oxygen kit. Just even that fine motor skill, or it's even a gross motor skill, of opening that zip to then get the bag valve mask out. And you know how they can collapse on themselves? They couldn't figure how to expand it, so it kept collapsing back on itself. And then I asked for a LMA to be put in, and we just changed our equipment to Supremes, and they had a bit of trouble even trying to figure out how that went in. And it turns out they'd never used one. And I continued to think, I thought that I was getting information about the other patient, but I wasn't hearing it correctly. I would hear little snippets like, he's got a heart rate of 100. He has a blood pressure of 120. And my brain was processing that as, that patient is completely fine. I will focus here. And so we continued to treat this patient. He had catastrophic injuries and he was unfortunately unable to be saved. I had to have a conversation with his father and mother on scene about how we had to cease resuscitation. There was no means for us to rapidly transport this child to hospital. It wasn't something that we were able to, if we were close to and had good resourcing and able to have crews, we may have put him in and transported him to the tertiary trauma centre, but it just wasn't an option. So we ceased resuscitation on him. He was in asystole from the start, and had that conversation with the parents. And I stood up and looked over to the other adolescent, and the HARU paramedic who was on duty came over and said, "This patient needs an RSI." And I pointed to the patient I'd just been treating and said, "He's in traumatic arrest. Why would he need an RSI?" And he looked at me like I had two heads and said, "No, that patient needs an RSI." And that is the first time, it would have been 15 minutes, that I actually looked at the scene for what it was. And I looked at this patient and I saw he was significantly short of breath. He had bilateral femur fractures. They weren't open, but you could see that his legs were deformed. He was really struggling to breathe and he was deathly pale. And I had not seen that. I had this moment of freeze where I felt extreme shame for letting go of what was meant to be a scene I was meant to be in charge of, and for tunnel visioning in on one patient when every doctrine you read on any kind of multi-casualty incident is that you are to be aware of every patient on that scene and to prioritise accordingly. Would I have still treated the patient in traumatic cardiac arrest because they had only just gone into arrest before we arrived? Maybe, probably, but I would have kept much more open focus on the treatment of the other patient and the treatment pathways.
That's really fascinating, Tash, from a number of reasons. And it doesn't take much from my revelation for that psychological overwhelm. And because there's multimodal piece of information, the scene's noisy, like you said, it's atypical as far as, you know, there's maybe the information coming to is changing, then it's children. And again, that can overwhelm because there's maths involved, or can be maths involved. But interestingly, the disabling of sensors is quite profound, because to your point, your peripheral vision, so you become unifocal on one thing, your hearing starts to dissipate, your sense of time starts to slow down, and also actually no, speed up. So actually what it is that you can't get an appreciation for the wider sense of time. But you're right, that shared situation awareness is absolutely uncoupled from you, and I can certainly relate to that. But just looking at how you approach, another thing I learned from my time on London HEMS was actually try and bring the division of labor together. So try and, as much as possible, bring the patients in a cohesive way, side by side. If there is another patient, you've got a good insight and oversight of the division of labor of the work in front of you. But that's great to say that. I certainly have had exactly the same as you, this really focused tunnel vision and not appreciation of the wider scene. And it's so easy to get sucked into that. But could you maybe speak to the revelations and your takeaways? Because listening to some of the interviews you've done in the past, I know you've carried a lot of this learning forward within your practice. Could you maybe speak to the seminal points you have carried forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think right from the start, I have taken away from it into my practice now that I prepare for going to jobs such as these before I even get to work. So the preparation begins on my way to work. So I'm setting myself up for going to a job that is atypical, once in a career kind of job on my drive. I think through methane sit reps. I think about how I'm going to triage people. The once in a career thing like a thoracotomy and helping a doctor with one of those. I hadn't done that until recently. It was about 3 years on HARU and 16 years in the ambulance service before I actually even saw one. And I had thought about that procedure on my drive to work and how I help with that every day, so that if that happened, I wasn't thinking about it for the first time. And so if I think about that noise on the way to the job and finding out new information and finding out their PEDs, I prepare myself that that's going to be the worst case scenario every job that I go to, so that when I turn up, I don't get that surprise and that startle. My brain is prepared for the worst thing to happen and for things to go wrong. So that's the first thing that I do to prepare and what I learned from it. And the second thing is yes, you can think that the performance of others can affect your own performance, and that potentially your first reaction will be, why can't they be better? And that's unfair, because, and the reason it's unfair is when I spoke about the LMA Supreme and them having never used it, I had used it, and I'd used it probably 20, 30 times. And the reason I'd got to use it 20, 30 times is because I was in a specialized role and I was getting sent to these high acuity jobs. So it is unreasonable for me to think that someone is incompetent or should be better when they've actually never had the opportunity to do it in real life. So that's the other thing, is that you need to be prepared that you're actually going to be doing some coaching when you're at things like this. And so be aware that you will take on people's cognitive load, and that is just an unfortunate part of being in the roles that we're in. But actually a really good part is that if you can really coach someone well and you can make them feel involved in the care, you empower them forward into the stuff that they can do. So if they are not able to achieve something that they feel that they can, and you put pressure on them and make them feel shame, their performance is gone. You may as well wipe them from the scene. They won't be able to help. And then you destroy that relationship with them as well. So that's the next thing that I take out of it. And then further on is trying to manage my reaction. So I'm not immune to getting a startle anymore. That's definitely not the case. You will go to something and for whatever reason, it triggers you to have this response. And so what I do is name it, and I name it out loud. I say, I'm starting to have a stress response, either to myself, or I've even been known to say it on a scene. I've been teased for it. But I'll say, I feel like I'm having a stress response here. I'm just going to take a few breaths. And that may be in the car on the way to the job. As I'm arriving, I'll take a few breaths. I'll try and slow my heart rate down, and I'll look around. I'll take a big look around of what I'm seeing. And one of the key things that I do is I never put my gloves on before I touch a patient. And what that has allowed me to do in my practice is that I can stand back while I'm taking that time to put my gloves on. And in that 20 seconds that takes, I'm able to take in the scene from a balcony view, to be able to figure out what my priorities are, who's there, what they're doing, where we're up to, and any major obvious things that are going on with the patient.
Oh, that's really interesting from a number of reasons, but like you said, it's fundamentally slowing yourself down, Tash, and I completely agree with that, actually, from a physiological perspective, because like you said, even just that looking around the cab or looking around the scene, what it's doing, it's reinforcing to you, and it would to me around there's a global picture here, and there's just making sure you're trying not to miss anything, and from a mechanism or indeed from another patient or indeed from bystanders, but having that wider view of the scene. Now, one of the things you also said, which I really appreciated, is you said, on the way to work, you're mentally rehearsing for the worst day of your life and how you would react, but also that comms piece. And one of my revelations from treating some really horrendous road traffic collisions or motor vehicle incidents was actually 2 or more patients can easily overwhelm me, especially with multimodal kind of there's lots of noise, there's maybe lots of clinical demands. To your point, the team may or may not be performing to the utmost, but treating it as a major incident and having that SBAR and or that ethane or methane or CS-CAT approach, just treating it as a mini major incident where there's simple signage, this was priority 1, and getting the major incident pack out, P1, P2, P3. And what that does is it's clear signage to the whole scene around the priorities on scene. It reminds you that you need to relay this SBAR information back to the control room and sort of declare the severity, but it reinforces to everyone what the priority is. And hopefully, if you can pull the clinical priorities together in one place, but doing that really starts to align the priorities on scene, and things start to flow a little bit more, because you're not pulled 20 feet or 30 feet that way for someone else, and still having to start again, and it really starts to get a semblance of control over where your priorities lie. And so I really like that piece, and like you said, you were kind of rehearsing that in your mind. Tash, could I just ask you sort of why startle occurs, why this amygdala hijack occurs, and indeed why it can affect performance?
Yeah, it's so when you're going to be affected by something like this, it's important to understand why it's happened and why we perform when we're not under pressure, and why when we're put under that bit of pressure, we can be affected by these things. So when you're not under pressure, you're using the majority of your brain where you're able to make clear cognitive thoughts, and they're thoughts that are meaningful, and they're based on prior decisions, prior information, prior experience, and you're able to drag that back from a meaningful place and put it into a nice row and make a decision from it. When you're under cognitive load, or you've had when you're under cognitive load and then to the extreme you're under a startle, the ability to withdraw that information is affected. So the pathways of your brain that are being used are different. The startle is that one where it's just like you're being attacked. Your brain thinks you're under threat. So it is that fight or flight or freeze that you will be affected by, and your decisions will be reactive. And so you're not able to make good, clear cognitive decisions in that phase. And so the decisions that you make may be based on incorrect filtered information from the effects that this has on you. So your vision gets really tunneled, your hearing becomes, and it's not this that you can't hear, it's that you can't interpret. So you can have exact, clear information given to you, but you can't interpret that information, and then you're unable to verbally speak. So you may notice that when you've previously been under stress, and I know that I've found this, that you're trying to give a clear sit rep on the radio and it comes across as garble. And I've heard that when people are calling for CCP backup, it's scattered and single words and a bit all over the place. And it's not because they're unable to, not good clinicians, it's that they're under a little bit of load. And I've definitely experienced that myself. And I let go of the receiver of the radio and go, that sounded terrible. So you're in this state where you're unable to take in your environment, take in the full picture, and then you're unable to make a decision to treat, or where do I go first, or what do I do here? And that decision that you make may seem absolutely appropriate at the time because the information that you got is exactly what you believe. But when you go back and look at it later, it was because you didn't hear it, you didn't see it, you hadn't done a full appreciation of something, you didn't finish a task that you started. And that's because of that time speeding up, slowing down. You think that, and you're under pressure, you get scattered and you can't have a good system of thought. So that's why it's so important to recognize that you're under stress and recognize that you may be put under stress so that you can try and combat that amygdala hijack that you get.
So I'm going to speak about and ask you about sort of switching off from a sort of sensory input, and I think what I just like, if you could speak to is this kind of how you claw things back, Tash. So how you, and in a way I could kind of roll two questions into one, really, around this sort of metacognition, thinking about how we're thinking and or thinking about how we're performing. But could I maybe get you to speak to how we claw things back, like you said, when we start to articulate, gosh, I've lost my peripheral vision, and or I haven't literally heard the last thing in the last minute. I haven't heard anything, although there's been lots of noise. How do we start to claw these things back?
Yeah, it's really important as clinical leaders that we're able to come into a scene and notice that someone may be under the effects of this, and how do we get them back on board with us without calling them out and saying you're stressed and not coping. So it's a real fine balance. And then how do we manage our own stress ourselves? So I think, as I said before, it's important to acknowledge that you are under stress and that the situation that we're in is overwhelming. And so I like to attend these scenes where things can be overwhelming and do a pause. So a pause to just reset and define where we are at. So I will come in and receive the handover like you usually would, and then I would ask to do a pause. And sometimes that's really hard because you can see that the patient may be deteriorating in front of you, that any kind of time may cause them to die in our care. Or if we delay anything even by a second, it can feel like that's going to adversely affect the care of the patient. But if the performance of the team isn't all leading in the same direction, then that's going to cause much more delay in what we're doing. So I like to come in, ask for everybody to listen along and define what we have. So this is the mechanism, this is the patient, this is what they're presenting with, and this is what my impression is of what their biggest issue is, and this is our treatment pathway forward. Does anyone think that I have missed anything? Does anyone have any extra comments here? And that then opens up that two-way conversation and closed loop communication to ensure that I've picked everything up that's important. They feel safe to speak up because I've asked for it, and that we can all move together on the same pathway, moving towards the same goal. And that usually seems to be enough to be able to bring the tempo of the job down. And you often hear the term slow is fast. And so it can, if they're rushing and things get missed and lines get pulled out, and I've done that before, I've put a line in, put a bag of fluids on it, not take the fluid line down, and then the whole line gets pulled out, and then you're back at square one. So if those things are done properly and meaningfully, then we're able to move forward to the same goal. To be able to bring myself down if I start to get overwhelmed, I'll usually just physically remove myself back slightly so that I can take in that view again, and I will take myself back through what have we got, where are we going with this, what are our goals, am I missing anything here? And doing that seems to ground it back, to get me grounded, to become back in touch with where we're going with it. One of the really good things on the HARU is, and it may feel like it's overbearing if you're looking at it from the outside, is that we have to call the consultant on call, the medical officer on call, before we provide our HARU scope of treatment to somebody, unless they're in traumatic cardiac arrest, of course, or there's something that we have to do immediately, which is very, very rare in our practice. And what that does is it means that you have to prepare for the phone call. So you're preparing to make it succinct, and then you have to explain what you think's happening, why you think it's happening, and how you're going to treat them to someone who's not there. And that is such a good way, that preparation for that is a good way to take that step back and really take it in. And so often when I've been preparing to do that, I've thought to myself, actually, I don't have this bit of information. I need to get that. And then it's ended up being key to the practice.
Tash, that's fantastic, because I think in essence that's a cognitive circuit breaker, because like you said, it's like, actually, right, I have to step out of this situation to then sequentially hand some information over in a coherent and clear and concise fashion. And actually it circuit breaks that visceral emotion and or that feeling or situation you're in, to step back, take a breath, right, what's the sequence of information, how concise can I be, and have I got a good read receipt from the consultant, and then clear plan, and absolutely building those circuit breakers in, I think, is key to having that clarity of mind, and also just a cohesive scene, because unless you can order your thoughts, it's really hard to drive the team forward. So I'm going to ask you, before we come on to sort of cognitive switches for going home, because I think that's a really important part of this conversation, just the last question I'd like to ask whilst we're still at scene and in the scene is around, and I'm only asking this because I've certainly been here as well, is around when the team isn't performing. And again, that might be yourself, might be the wider team, but actually the trajectory of the team dynamics are starting to descend. The wheels are proverbially coming off. How do you affect the team in those circumstances? Almost these kind of immediate action drills, or that you might instigate on scene when things are really starting to come apart.
Yeah, these are the tricky ones. These are the ones where you can start to feel that things are starting to fall apart and you get dragged into it as well. And it's really important to ensure that the way that we approach things like this keep everybody psychologically safe, because the jobs that we go to can be so traumatic in themselves. And if we add on top of that we're making somebody feel like they're not valued and that they're underperforming, it can have a significant psychological impact on them into the future, as well as their ability to deal with the job in itself and the trauma around the job. So I think it's really important that if you feel those wheels coming off in regard to the team performance, that you have the ability to help that person through what it is that's getting them stuck where they are, and having that clear conversation with them. And I like to approach it by starting with, do you need a hand, or is there something that you're struggling with here? And if they say yes, then do I have a plan B for that? Is there someone else that can do it? Can I do it? Or can I quickly and effectively coach them through it? And I think the really important thing in all of our practice is that even if we go up through the accreditation and ranks of our clinical care, it's important to still be an expert at the care delivered at the very base level. So that's even first aid. So you need to be an expert at still being able to do that. In my view, it's not acceptable for us to not be able to put a traction splint on a patient because we haven't done it in a long time, because someone else in the team always does that. We need to still be creatures of habit, and our habits form our practice under pressure. And so I like to ensure that I have not just practiced intubating a mannequin if I haven't done it for a while, or walking through the steps of a finger thoracostomy, or how do I do upper bloodline. That's not the stuff that I focus on all the time. It's, can I put a traction splint on? Can I explain how to put a traction splint on? Do I know how to change a seal on an oxygen kit? It's those habits that start right at the start of your career of, am I an expert in this kind of piece of equipment so that I can help someone who's under stress? And so during the job, I'm able to help them and able to coach them. And usually it's in there, and it's about, it's okay if you're struggling. It is absolutely okay if you feel like you're under pressure. I can help you through here. And let me know if you want me to do this, and I can move you to somewhere else. And is there something that you would prefer to be doing in this moment? So can you put an IV in for me? And just that safety of speaking up. If you're struggling with that, please let me know. Because we'll often say to someone, can you go and put a line in, put some fluids up, and let me know when you're done. There can be some fear in speaking up if you're struggling. So I also like to add on to that, let me know if you're having trouble, and I'll come in and give you a hand. So that there's that safety of speaking up, so that when we're just about to ready to push the drugs for induction, that's not the moment that we find out that the line hasn't been popped in.
So Tash, just going forward, I really like that, and the adage of that supportive and or servant leadership, whereby you're prepared to get your hands dirty. Nothing is, no skill is beyond you, no matter how gross or fine the motor skill is. But just coming to the debrief and then to the home piece, and just looking at the debrief, Tash, could you maybe speak to how you conduct a hot debrief, and maybe just the tools of approach, and just the recognition of how challenging the scene might have been?
Yeah, it's really important to ensure that everybody's able to have an understanding of what happened on scene. And you'll experience this as well, is that especially when we run in teams of 2 on the HARU, so us and a medical officer, we can turn up on scene, all this amazing work has been done, and we take the patient, and essentially they think we take the glory, and take them off to the hospital, and they may not even know what we've done. So there's no opportunity to do teaching sometimes during the case, as the patients are so unwell. And the role of the advanced care paramedics, who have done the real life-saving stuff at the start of some of these jobs, is that they get the privilege of driving our car up to the hospital. So it's really important that everybody gets to know what the care was provided to the patient, why it was provided, and why we did the things that we did in the way that we did it. And we need to close that loop for them to understand what has happened on the scene, as well as share our learnings and our failures, so that, and we are learning every day, every job, there is something that comes out of these jobs every time we do them. And that's the best thing about doing this role, is that you get to continuously learn, and you're able to try and improve those things on the next job. And it's really important as clinical leaders that we're sharing our failures, our successes, and where our pinch points for how we could do better were. And so I like to start the debrief off, obviously checking that everyone is psychologically safe and wanting to participate. So you never want to force someone to participate in something that may cause them further distress in that hot environment. And that allows me to be able to figure out if I need to tell one of our supervisors that this person requires further referral through to support services. And then I like to just do a brief overview of the case. And usually I'll try and get one of our advanced care paramedics to facilitate the debrief. So they'll lead it and run it and ask everybody of their impression of the case, something that they did really well and something that they'd love to improve in the future. And so it's not me saying you should improve this, but they're leading this. And then I'm able to say, this is something I absolutely need to improve. And it gives them the ability to feed things back to us on our practice. And we're able to encourage improvement as well.
I really like that two-way transfer of both information, of reflection and revelation from the role, because and from the scene, because like you said, there's precious piece of feedback for your practice and indeed my practice that actually is super valuable from, like you say, ACPs or indeed junior clinicians and all across the spectrum actually that you can take. But like you say, being open to that is super valuable, because incremental feedback, good or bad, indeed the bad is probably more informative than the good, because you can certainly work on that and look at trended patterns. So I really like that that format, Tash. Just looking at going home now. So just could you maybe speak to your experiences of these cognitive switching and cognitive triggers, just from being at work to going home? Because like you said, it's this massive rush of visceral emotion. You know, it's been maybe lots of different clinical scenarios, challenging and otherwise, lots of technical, non-technical skills, lots of pivots on scene and after scene. And then you've got to have some semblance of normality and going back to normality, normal family life. And some paramedics really struggle with that, really struggle with the transcending the waves of emotion and sort of and bring it back into family life. How do you switch off, Tash? And how do you sort of switch that cognitive trigger?
Yeah, I probably haven't been as healthy in this as I probably should be throughout my career, but I do try and focus on working through the case before I come into my house. So it's important that we try not to bring distress and reactive feelings home and it gets pushed on to our families. I have a little bit of a benefit that I have a husband who's a critical care paramedic, an emergency nurse, and he obviously works in the same area as me. So often I'll call him on my way home and we'll have a chat through what the day was, what I thought I should have done better, how things went well, and really work through that on the way home. But on days that I don't speak to him about that, I'll often call my mum and just speak to her about her day and what she's been doing and what she's been up to with her friends. And that almost resets me back to a normal life. So she speaks about the normal general going-ons of people that don't see what we see. And that helps me set back to the world isn't all doom and gloom. This is the rarity, and we see it because that is our role to see it. And that there is happiness and brightness in the world. And my mum is like perfect for bringing me back to that. And it means that I get to spend a good deal of time speaking to her. But there are times that you do bring it home and that you can't stop thinking about it. And that's where it's really important to reach out for debrief with your peers, debrief with our medical officers as well. And if you still can't get through it, there's no shame in asking for professional help around working through these feelings. And a lot of it, when I've had to do it, has been that I felt shame around my performance and practice. either I feel that I haven't communicated well with staff, I've made them feel hurt or not heard, or I haven't empowered them, or I feel like my performance should have been better and it may have impacted the care of a patient. And so it is really important to seek professional advice if you need it. And then the other things that are important is just exercise, sunlight, getting out and about, seeing your friends, or just going for a walk and being in situations and environments where you're doing something else, you're thinking about something else, and that you're able to work through the thoughts and feelings that you have.
So Tash, just looking at the lessons you've taken from practice around sort of the nuances of non-technical skills. So just understanding sort of the tempo of the scene, and indeed what matching your communication and or technical, non-technical skills to that scene. Because to your earlier point, you know, not every scene is like a fifth gear racing in, or indeed none of them are racing in, but you learn to approach jobs and or incidents in different ways and different paces depending on what the scene needs. But could you maybe speak to how you do that, how you judge what the scene needs and sort of match that with your communication and or technical, non-technical skills?
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone new that comes into HARU, I give them advice that 98% of our job is communication, and that the rest of it is the skills. You can disrail a scene immediately if you come in with your tempo higher than others, or you come in and don't appreciate that they're telling you that somebody is sick and you're just dismissive of it. So I think it's super, and that's the advice that I was given as well when I started, is that 98% of his communication, whether it's with the crews, with the CCPs, with the hospital, or with the medical officers that are giving us the consult advice when we call up. So what I've learned from definitely failing is that if you come in and you have any kind of ego, or if you are dismissive, or you speak over the top of somebody when they're handing over, or you steam ahead without anybody else's advice, you're going to throw the entire job. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's just an isolated femur fracture, a simple asthma in a pediatric, or a significant multi-trauma. If you do that, even if there is a sense of urgency, it's going to go wrong. Something's going to happen. Someone's going to get stressed. A drug error is going to happen. So if you come in and you base your communication on good introductions, tell people who you are, listen to the information that they have, ask them if they have any immediate concerns, and then allow the people who are already leading the team to continue to lead the team if that's appropriate, and step up and have graded assertiveness if it's required. So if there becomes something that is absolutely imminent, needs to happen, you can start to move the team around. So move the CCP to do what the ACP was doing so it can get done faster, and start to push the job forward. And that's not always needed, as you said. So it's very rare that you'll have to turn up and decompress someone's chest or pop a tube in straight away, or all of these things can have meaningful time before them. So it's about not scaring people and making people under pressure, and that communication is so key there.
So something you just said, Tash, earlier around just the simple things in life, like around just getting out and enjoying nature when you're not on shift, or appreciation of that your lens and or experience in the past 12 hours is atypical and is maybe 0.5% of what the rest of the world see and do, and returning to that baseline of normality from other people's lives. So is really powerful, because I think one of my last questions is around sort of revelations around self-care and how you transition into self-care role within HARU, and indeed as a wider person and as a wider team, because you are, to your earlier point, you're seeing these high stress, high fidelity, highly challenging situations and clinical presentations on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. But how do you orchestrate self-care, Tash?
It can even start while I'm at work. So once I've finished a case, especially on night shifts, I'll go and drive the car to complete any paperwork that I have while looking at the Story Bridge, which is one of our lovely bridges over Brisbane. I'll just sit there and look at the view, think through the job, take it in, and then just go back to station where I need to finish the rest of the stuff that I have. And then self-care is super important with regard to ensuring that you're eating well, that you're drinking well, that you're avoiding anything that may worsen any kind of symptoms that you have. So I probably don't obviously do this as well as I probably should as well because shift work, but just having that balanced dinner, not drinking enough water, not going overboard on alcohol, all of those kind of things that can be unhealthy mechanisms. And if you find yourself falling into that kind of thing, it may be that first flag that something's not right. And then just the care of my family and kids and trying not to impact them with things that may be going on at work. And if it is getting too overwhelming, do I need to take a step back from this role and do something else for a couple of weeks so that I can come back in refreshed? Or do I need leave? And if I do have set leave and shifts need to be covered, do I say no? Because I need to make sure that I'm set in myself to be able to continue to perform as I do. And the most important thing in our world is being able to come back safely to your family and enjoy your life outside of work.
And just finally, Tash, is there any take-home messages you'd like to give to, or indeed sort of salient take-home points you'd like to give to listeners around this conversation?
I think a good point that I'd like to make is that you fall back on your habits under pressure. And so it is all about building really good habits. And if you approach every case, and I know you can get low acuity fatigue, but if you approach every case that you go to as if it is the sickest case that you're going to, you take a rest break. You don't just write 14 in your paperwork. You sit there and count it for a minute. You feel a radial pulse. You check capillary refill. You look at their breathing. You take every bit of kit in. You ensure you do a full set of vital signs. On every trauma you go to, you do a thorough head to toe, right from head to toe. If that's your base level of practice, you'll be able to fall back on that under pressure because that's your habit. And I think if I could give anything to anyone, it is that you should just really build really strong habits.
Listen, that's fantastic. And I couldn't agree more, actually. Tash, thank you for the last hour. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.